Thank you to everyone at EUI responsible for the existence of this lecture. Starting with Youssef, but not ending there, starting with Youssef for his exceptionally lengthy, literate, and coherent introduction. I think he's given my research program more coherence than it deserves. I wish I could describe it in the same seamless fashion that you just did. Minimal conditions for the survival of the euro. You will see that the title of this lecture has morphed a little bit as I began to think about it. I'm going to present you with two kinds of reflections on the euro 25 years on, one which looks back and the other of which looks, of course, forward. The presentation will essentially be in two parts. The first part on why the euro area continues to experience problems. That's the look back. And what is to be done, in my view, given a realistic assessment of the constraints, and that will be the part that attempts to look forward. Why after 25 years, when, after all, the euro has only existed for 18? One is that we economists are prone to rounding error. Another answer is because it is precisely 25 years since my most cited publication in economics, co-authored with Tam Bayoumi, which was called, I couldn't find a better reproduction of it than this, Shocking Aspects of European Monetary Unification, in which we argued that preceding with a large monetary union, including not only the Northern European core, but also the Club Med countries, Southern Europe. There are other acronyms that are now used to denote those countries, that proceeding with a large monetary union would be problematic. To put it bluntly, that doing so would be a mistake. We built on the theory of optimum currency areas following Robert Mundell and others, that of course being the framework, dominant framework used by economists to study the suitability of different national groupings for forming a monetary union. The theory of optimum currency areas has different dimensions, depending in part on what the focus is, depending in part on who the author is. But an important strand, probably the single most important strand in that literature, emphasizes the symmetry or asymmetry of macroeconomic shocks and speed of adjustment to those shocks. Our title was meant as a play on words, as a pun, my co-author and I both being prone to punning, but it was taken seriously in some circles as intending a devastating critique of the monetary union project, and it's for the readers to judge whether that second interpretation of the title was justified or not. We kept the economic modeling as simple as possible, that being another predilection of the co-authors. So we built on the very, very most basic aggregate supply, aggregate demand model that you can use to think about an aggregate economy, upward sloping short-run aggregate supply curve, downward sloping aggregate demand curve, as in the top. And then you can subject this model to a positive aggregate supply shock, which shifts both the short and long-run supply curves to the right, raising prices permanently as you move from the initial intersection of the supply and demand curves to the new intersection to the right and upward. And you can use this model similarly to think about positive aggregate demand shocks, which raise output only in the short run because long run aggregate supply remains unchanged. But in this simple framework, a positive aggregate demand shock raises prices, even in the long run. You move, in the demand shock case, up the short-run aggregate supply curve, up and to the right, and then up and to the left as you move back to the long-run equilibrium. So we then went on and tried to estimate these two relationships as straightforwardly as we could, using time series on prices and output, country by country, one country at a time in the first instance. And we distinguished two shocks, one that was constrained to affect output only temporarily, but prices permanently. That was the temporary, or the so-called aggregate demand shock. And a second disturbance that was allowed to affect both output and prices permanently, the permanent or so-called aggregate supply shock. We did this by imposing a couple of constraints on the disturbances and estimated a simple bivariate auto-regression in prices and output, or more precisely, the dependent variables were the percentage change in prices and the percentage change in output, with two lags on each of these variables and the relevant structural restrictions imposed. The economists in the audience will recognize this as a variant of the model of aggregate supply and demand dynamics first estimated by Blanchard and Qua in slightly different form, I think, in 1988. And then we took the resulting estimates of the disturbances country by country, and we looked at whether they were correlated across countries in the case of Europe, correlated with the disturbances affecting the anchor country or center country, Germany in particular. And as a benchmark, as a basis of comparison, we did the same thing for US regions, looking at whether the disturbances observed in different US census regions, of which there are about 10, were correlated with those of the mid-Atlantic states, which seemed to us to be the plausible anchor regions. So the standard of comparison for what is a sufficiently smoothly functioning monetary union, sufficiently smoothly functioning to survive, was the United States, and the question was how Europe compared. So here are a couple of plots of the correlation of aggregate supply disturbances in different European countries, with those in Germany on the horizontal axis, and aggregate demand disturbances in different European countries on the vertical axis, with a similar plot for the United States. So if you want to be a smoothly functioning monetary union, you want to be near the upper right corner, where the shocks impinging on your local or regional or national economy are relatively highly correlated with those in the anchor region with which you're sharing a common monetary policy. And you can see that a couple of things in this figure. Number one, Europe met these criteria less well, less completely, less obviously than did the United States in this earlier period, where the earlier period ended in 1988. We published the article in 1992. And secondly, there seems to be a distinction between a couple of clusters of countries in the European case. Clustered toward the upper right are countries like the Benelux, Denmark, and France. And then the European core, if you will, where disturbances are relatively highly correlated with those in Germany. And then there was the European periphery, if you will, the potential problem countries, which were none other than, you don't have to hold your breath here, Greece, Italy, Ireland, Spain, Portugal, and the UK, as it happened. Core, periphery, conditions for monetary union not as obviously met as in the United States, and the case for large monetary union encompassing both the European core and the European periphery especially problematic. That was our finding. So one thing one can do is to update these estimates use the same method, but data from 1994 through 2015, both for the European countries, labeled here the EA, I guess, Euro area for better or for worse, the red dots, and the various US regions, the blue dots, and you can see that one of our two patterns continues to hold. Shocks remain much less correlated with the anchor region in Europe than in the United States. So one interpretation of the earlier results had been that Europe experiences much more diverse aggregate demand disturbances because it doesn't have a single monetary policy, as does the United States. Well, now Europe does have a single monetary policy, and yet that problem of more diverse aggregate demand disturbances has not entirely gone away. That's the first observation. Another observation to make is that there's very little change in the patterns across US regions. They're still up and to the right relative to the European points. Who is especially highly correlated with the mid-Atlantic? New England is no different than before. The far west and the mountain states are not as highly correlated because of natural resource. They're natural resource exporters rather than importers, among other things. The Great Lakes have moved away from the Northeast, maybe because manufacturing has moved away from the Great Lakes. And what is unexpected here, the surprise to us is that the countries where aggregate demand shocks especially, but it would appear from these estimates, aggregate supply shocks as well, have grown more symmetric with those in Germany, are not the Northern European countries, but rather the crisis countries. So now if you want to use the core periphery terminology, which I would be reluctant myself to use in this context, it looks like the core is made up of Germany and Greece and Italy and Spain and Portugal and Ireland. Those are the economies disturbances to which appear to be moving together in the more recent period. So something clearly has changed in the behavior of the data and the correlation of predictable movements and disturbances, and the questions are these new results to be believed? And if so, what might they be reflecting? So our preferred interpretation, and then we go on and do some reality checks to see whether this preferred interpretation is plausible or not, is that this new correlation reflects capital flows between Northern Europe and Southern Europe on a scale that didn't exist before the euro. Capital flows from Germany, if you will, or from Germany and France more broadly before the crisis struck in 2008, 2009 to Southern Europe. And then the reversal of those flows, German growth decelerates, growth in Southern Europe decelerates even more dramatically at the same time as a result of the reversal of the previous capital flows. So one way to do the reality check to try to look at this a little bit more directly is to include a variety of financial variables, interest rates and other things as controls in the VAR out of which we back the disturbances. And when we include those financial variables, the correlation between Germany and the European periphery goes down quite considerably, as if that correlation in the more recent period is heavily associated with those financial variables, as if the correlation is being driven by the financial factors and the capital flows that are our preferred interpretation. The other thing that we found was interesting in updating the results is what the impulse response functions look like. So if you have a bivariate vector autoregression involving inflation and growth, which is what we have, you can shock it and see whether output shocks to the temporary disturbances and shocks to the permanent disturbances generate not only the output response that is baked in to the model, by the restrictions that are imposed, but also the response of prices that is not baked in, that might be evident or might not. So this is what we find for the United States. This is what we found for Europe in the earlier period. This is what we continue to find for non-Euro area countries in the recent period, that when you subject output to a temporary positive shock, output goes up, inflation goes up, and then output returns by construction to its initial level consistent with long-run aggregate supply, and prices continue to rise as that increased demand is reconciled with the fixed level of long-run supply. So the price response I show you there in blue from a positive shock to temporary shock to demand is not baked into the model, but that's exactly what the standard aggregate supply, aggregate demand model would suggest. Right-hand quadrant of the stylized figure here to the left. And similarly, a positive permanent shock to output, meaning we interpret as a positive shock to aggregate supply. Look at how in the short run output rises, prices begin to fall, and in the longer run, as the short run aggregate supply curve rotates to its vertical long run position, prices continue to fall and output continues to rise, exactly like the impulse response in orange. On the right, what the model predicts is what the data generate for the United States, shown here. For Europe in the earlier period where our data ended in 1988, for non-Euro area countries that we continue to look at today, from Canada to the UK to a variety of other cases, but not for the Euro area. So this looked like something of a mystery, that the impulse responses for Europe now look peculiar, where for the now Euro area countries they were well behaved before. They now look like this, where positive permanent shocks to output raise output by construction, but now they raise prices rather than lowering it. There's something peculiar here going on with the data that was not going on before. And positive temporary shocks to output, demand shocks, appear to lower prices rather than raise them in a manner inconsistent with the standard textbook model that I show you in stylized fashion here on the left. So how might we understand this? What are the underlying economics? We can construct an argument, and I'm about to give you that argument, but I will acknowledge that there is something strange and perplexing going on here in the behavior of the data. So here is my stylized model consistent with these two new impulse responses for the Euro area countries for the period since the mid-1990s. Our hypothesis is that a positive aggregate supply shock, as on the left, sets off a positive aggregate demand shock, a form of hysteresis. And think about the post-crisis period, a negative aggregate demand shock sets off a positive short-run aggregate supply shock, another form of hysteresis. In other words, the impulse responses look like this. If you allow me to assume a positive aggregate supply shock that elicits matching aggregate demand shock, you get dynamics as in the first panel on the right. That looks like the red impulse response. And if you give me an aggregate demand shock that endogenously elicits an aggregate supply response, you get an impulse response exactly like the blue line on the left. So this is one conjecture about what might be going on in the data, and the economic story that would go along with these patterns would run like this. What's going on is our hysteresis and the financial cycle, where the financial cycle means that a positive supply shock sets off a financial response that also affects demand, and that a positive demand shock And that positive demand shock was permanent, hence the hysteresis, absent something else. So here's a story about hysteresis and the financial shock and the cycle. Consider the left-hand panel. Consider the advent of the euro, which makes for a more stable and competitive environment. Those are some of the things that the authors of One Market, One Money told us the euro was going to do. That's a positive supply shock, a more stable environment conducive to investment, more competitive environment conducive to efficiency. So the euro creates a positive supply shock that raises output. The more stable environment, in other words, increases supply, that boosts productivity and profitability. But that in turn raises asset prices and sets off a lending boom. The lending boom increases aggregate demand. Spaniards are buying homes and Greeks are going out to dinner. In the case depicted, even more than supply, and the result is higher prices. So that's the pre-2008 case when the peripheral countries experienced a positive supply shock, a lending boom, higher output together with higher prices, and ultimately a loss in competitiveness. Now you can run the same experiment in reverse post-2008. Think of a negative supply shock now due to impairment of the financial system. Lower prices mean an asset price slump and therefore less lending. Demand falls along with supply. The supply curve shifts to the left. That induces a leftward shift in the demand curve. The result is recession and deflation, and hysteresis in this case means that there's a permanent decline in output absent another shock. And for completeness, we have a story about the right-hand panel that is a bit more labored, in my view. Maybe I will pass over it for the moment in the interest of time. So my conclusion on the basis of this analysis is that it should not be a surprise that the euro area continues to experience difficulties. The euro area remains further than the benchmark represented by the United States from satisfying the preconditions for optimum currency area status. Shocks are still more asymmetric, less highly correlated with those in the anchor region than is the case in the US. And one could elaborate that argument along a number of other dimensions, that adjustment remains more difficult in Europe. No fiscal federalism, lower levels of labor mobility. You will be familiar with those articles, those arguments. Moreover, the evidence suggests that the euro had positive efficiency effects in Europe, but the positive supply shock also had financial effects that were not entirely anticipated and whose impact was not entirely beneficial. The euro also unleashed large-scale capital flows between Northern and Southern Europe that elevated asset prices in the South. The resulting lending boom boosted demand in Southern Europe. That led to an artificial period of prosperity, but also a permanent loss of competitiveness absent additional shocks, suggesting the need to do something about this capital flow problem, if you will, and its impact. So that's my backward look, my, in a nutshell, depiction of the performance and the problems of the euro area in its first 17 years, leading to part two, my view of what is to be done. So for some people, the what is to be done question should be framed as, how can Europe boldly go where no collection of sovereign member states has gone before? How can it take a quantum leap now toward deeper integration and complete its Monetary union, it should complement its single monetary policy with a single fiscal policy, create a federal fiscal system, establish a true single labor market, create a political union to provide accountability for those making these Eurozone-wide fiscal, monetary, and labor policies. So we can give this idea two names. We can call it the Five Presidents Report, or we can call it social science fiction, because we know that there is no appetite in Europe for political union, for a forced march toward deeper political integration, or at least that's my assessment from where I sit 5,000 miles away. Given that, the way I would prefer to frame the question is, can we imagine more limited steps that acknowledge the existence of constraints, limits on how rapidly Europe can move in the direction of deeper political integration, that would nonetheless have a stabilizing impact on the operation of the monetary union, or yet another framing that would be compatible with my more limited view of the reform agenda would be, can we imagine a way that monetary union could be made to work without political union? And if you can't imagine it, there is an obvious alternative. So I will argue that 4 steps, all of which are at least conceivable in the absence of political union, also conceivably suffice for the survival of the euro area. Number 1 is, so all of these involve completing processes that are in some sense underway and have in some sense been underway for a while. Number 1, establishing a normal central bank. Number 2, completing the banking union. Number 3, maybe it hasn't been underway yet, but should be renationalizing fiscal policy. And number 4, removing debt overhangs where they exist and create problems of sustainability and create problems for the exercise of reasonable policy autonomy. So why have I come to focus on these 4 things? Because I like to think about a simple framework, namely club theory, for when I think about what kind of essential economic functions need to be centralized at the level of an economic or monetary union, and what kind of functions can be or should be carried out at a more decentralized level. So the basic insights of club theory, of Buchanan, of the principle of subsidiarity, you can call it various things. The basic principles are 2, where tastes are relatively homogeneous and where spillovers across states are significant, and there are increasing returns, therefore, to collective action, decision-making should be centralized. But where spillovers are more limited and or tastes for policies and outcomes are more heterogeneous, then there's an argument for decentralizing responsibility. So let me think about my 4 essential functions with that, from that point of view. I would define a normal central bank as one able to pursue normal monetary policy, call it flexible inflation targeting, and able to backstop banking systems and markets and government bonds as needed, thereby protecting the euro area from potentially self-fulfilling crises of confidence. If that's what you think a central bank should do, then I would argue in the European context that both theory and evidence argue for strongly centralized provision. We know, we have seen, we have learned that the spillovers of monetary policy and doubts about the integrity of the euro area are powerful, that what happens in Greece or Italy doesn't stay in Greece or Italy, and that preferences over issues of monetary policy and financial stability are not that different across member states. So I wrote it, and then I paused and thought, if I was giving this paper in Germany, would they agree with this statement? But I think I would be prepared to defend it, that preferences over inflation are not that different across the euro area, give or take a couple of percentage points, and that now there is a recognition, even in, how should I put it politely, informed German circles, that the central bank has an important role to play in backstopping banking systems and financial markets. So that's an argument that this is a realm where spillovers are powerful and tastes are relatively similar across member states, pointing to centralized provision, not something that was really provided by the European Central Bank at birth. So the ECB's two-pillar strategy, you will recall, focused on inflation and monetary aggregates, not on the lender and liquidity provider of last resort functions. Even the inflation targeting has been asymmetric, 2% or below, not normal inflation targeting as I would define it, and the ECB concentrated on headline inflation rather than core inflation in the Trichet days, causing it to commit errors like raising interest rates in 2008 and again twice in 2011. So things have changed under Draghi. Do whatever it takes, and outright monetary transactions have, if you will, addressed the backstopping banks and financial markets function. The ECB has moved toward acknowledging, ECB board members have made speeches about a symmetric inflation target and backed up their speeches with QE and a capital key to hit that target. What more needs to be done to establish a normal central bank in Europe? Normal central banking, as I've described it, encompasses a fairly broad range of functions. And the broader the range of functions undertaken by an independent government agency, the more transparent that agency has to be in order to be accountable to its principles. So the ECB may have moved toward publishing minutes. It doesn't publish votes, right? There's still things I think it would need to do in terms of enhancing its transparency and accountability. And a normal central bank needs to be able to move quickly. The governing council, I think, needs to be streamlined in order to achieve that. And there need to be a once and for all end to political challenges to the central bank and what it can be done, resolve once and for all those German Constitutional Court challenges about OMT, about QE, about whether exceptional circumstances, unconventional circumstances justify unconventional policies. Is all this politically feasible? I do think the ECB has moved significantly from where it started before the crisis to where it is now in terms of becoming a normal central bank, although it needs to still do a little bit more. Function number two that I think should be centralized, or club theory suggests should be centralized, is bank supervision and regulation and functions related to that. So the crisis certainly underscored how banking system stability is a euro area-wide public good, subject to strongly increasing returns. Spillovers are powerful, in other words. And again, my own empirical work points to how lax regulation of French and German banks allowed those institutions to lend hand over fist to Southern European countries prior to the crisis, something that set the stage for what followed and how the subsequent problems of some banks then threatened to spill over and infect other European banks through the interbank market. So I would assert experience has taught us, if we didn't know before, that this is an area where strongly increasing returns from centralized provision dominate any costs of uniformity. The point is sometimes put, monetary union without banking union will not work. I would feel comfortable about putting it that way. The single most egregious mistake that European officials made in the early 1990s was to go ahead with monetary union without making adequate preparations for banking union. So now they are making preparations and some progress. Europe now has half a banking union, right? It has a single supervisor, primarily for the 130 biggest banks, where the single supervisor also has oversight of the national supervisors in kind of a federal system to deal with those nettlesome smaller banks. How well that kind of federalized hierarchical banking supervision will work, time will tell. Do we need to move further where the single supervisor has direct supervisory oversight of all potentially systemically important banks in Europe? I would be inclined to argue yes. The banking union needs to be complemented by an adequate resolution mechanism to resolve bad banks. Here we are in Italy, where we are reminded daily that there is a resolution mechanism that's highly problematic, that includes so many constraints that it's not clear supervisors and regulators have the mechanisms they need to quickly intervene and resolve bad banks. And there's still no harmonized deposit insurance with a common financial backstop. There are reservations about moving further down the road toward banking union in Germany, where you stop a person on the street and they think banking union means Germans bailing out Italian banks, right? So now we can thank Deutsche Bank that maybe it will change the terms of that conversation, and there is hope that there will be agreement across Northern and Southern Europe about the desirability of completing the banking union. I would argue that club theory suggests renationalizing fiscal policy rather than trying to centralize it further. You will know that the EU approach has been to centralize fiscal policy to add to the Stability and Growth Pact, this pact and that pact, and a variety of additional fiscal rules on the grounds that the cross-border spillovers of national fiscal policies are large. If you look at the data and models we have, they are not consistent with this notion that the cross-border spillovers of fiscal policy are large. In the standard textbook model, my fiscal expansion has ambiguous effects on you because of offsetting effects. My fiscal expansion increases the demand for your exports to me, but it also increases interest rates, both in my country and your country, which has a depressing effect on spending, other things equal. So there's the direct effect operating through spending and the indirect effect operating through interest rates that cut in different directions and largely cancel one another out when you're talking about ongoing deficits. And here is an area where it's very clear that tastes are highly heterogeneous across states. There's nothing more distinctive about a country than who it chooses to tax, how it chooses to tax them, what it chooses to spend its tax revenues on. So I think both heterogeneity of tastes and the limited magnitude of spillovers relative to the other issue areas that I describe point in the direction of not centralizing fiscal policy, but returning it to the national level, returning it to national control. Renationalization is simple to say, and it's hard to do. I think doing it requires two things. Number one, a credible no bailout rule, so Italy gets to run the fiscal policy it prefers, but if it mismanages its fiscal policy, it has to bear the consequences and doesn't get bailed out. That in turn requires disconnecting banks and government bond markets, not force-feeding government bonds to the banks. So then there is a mechanism for contagion and cross-border spillovers and an incentive for bailouts, which you would want to make go away in order to render the renationalization of fiscal policy and a real no bailout rule credible. And number two, in order for countries to use their fiscal policy, you've got to remove the inherited debt overhangs. Otherwise, there will be little scope for national action and discretion. Otherwise, everybody ends up looking like Greece today, and spillovers due to default and solvency concerns will be widespread and amplified. I write here, we know how to do debt restructuring. Europe has just shown a reluctance to deploy that knowledge, and there is a long conversation hiding behind that point. So, to conclude, Mr. Chairman, the question going forward is, does the euro area need more integration or less integration? And we now know, of course, that the answer is both. And club theory suggests the dimensions on which the monetary union needs more integration and the dimensions along which it needs less. Thank you.